nobody had really sat down from the family's point of view, understandably so, to tell what it was like being a family member of Ted Bundy. And when I first started this, thinking about doing this project, I had turned 70, and I have to tell you, turning 70 is kind of a big deal. You think you're really a young person until you turn 70, at least in my mind. And you realize that you're not immortal, that you may not be around to tell the story. Having been a history major, I truly believe that this, as much as I don't like being part of this particular historical event, that this is part of history, and I wanted to tell our side of the story. And also, I needed to get it out of my system. I had hidden it for so long that I realized that's not healthy to keep things like this under wraps, things that are traumatic. It was traumatic for us. Nothing compared to what the families went through. That's a whole other level of trauma. And even his immediate siblings, I mean, that's way more trauma for them as well. But it was still trauma for us too, because it was such a shocking and horrific thing to realize that somebody you trusted was the opposite of what you ever thought they were. And it made it so you had doubts about your willing to judge people. It changed the way I looked at people. If I met somebody, especially men, unfortunately, thank God I already had Dawn in my life. But you couldn't help it but wonder if there was something else behind there. So I felt like it was important to tell my story. And I also thought about the families a lot too, and how some of these young women's remains have never been found yet to this day. And those families haven't had a chance to put those, their daughters to rest, or their sisters to rest. It just, that still bothers me a lot.
Hmm.
Yeah, he loved to drop by. He loved hanging out with my girlfriends and me. He loved being the center of attention. So we were these scruffy college kids, with long hair and jeans, and we were all broke, just kind of living hand to mouth. And he actually had jobs. I mean, he had all these really interesting things that he was doing. He was on this path for success. And that's what's so, you kind of, part of me mourns the loss of his potential too. I mean, he was really seemed to be on his way to do stuff where he'd worked on a re-election campaign for the governor, was undercover, in the enemy, not the enemy, but the opposition camp, to find out the
Hmm.
scoop on Governor Evans' opponent. He was on the Seattle Crime Commission. He was going to law school. He had just gotten back from Stanford, where he was studying Mandarin.
She still wears gloves to touch them. Not because they are fragile, not because they are old, but because even now, more than 30 years after the man who wrote them was put to death, she swears she can feel something coming off the pages. Something she has no clinical word for, something she simply calls evil. The letters are handwritten. The penmanship is careful. The language is measured, almost philosophical. And they were sent to her personally. Not to a journalist, not to a detective, to his cousin, the woman who grew up beside him, the woman who felt safe because he lived nearby, the woman who had no idea that while he was installing her door locks, he was also choosing his next victim. Tonight we go inside the mind of Ted Bundy. Not the headline version, not the documentary villain. We are going further into the psychology of how a predator builds his cover, into the forensic trail he left across 7 states, and into the letters that reveal, in his own words, a mind that never once felt remorse. This is what it looks like when the monster is also the family member you trusted most. Before we examine what Ted Bundy did, we need to understand what Ted Bundy was, because the question that has haunted criminologists, behavioral scientists, and the people who knew him is not simply, how did he kill so many women? The more disturbing question is this: how did he live so convincingly among the people who should have seen him? Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24th, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, to an unmarried woman named Eleanor Louise Cowell. The identity of his biological father was never confirmed. He was raised for the first years of his life by his maternal grandparents, who presented themselves publicly as his parents, a secret that shaped his early psychology in ways researchers would later find significant. A child told his origins are shameful learns early how to suppress the truth of himself. When his mother married a man named Johnny Bundy, and the family moved to Tacoma, Washington, Ted was given a new name, a new father, and a new narrative. He was a clean slate, presentable, smart, the kind of boy adults noticed for the right reasons. By the time he reached the University of Washington, the architecture was nearly complete. He studied psychology, a choice that, in hindsight, tells us everything. Not because it is unusual to study psychology, but because Bundy was not studying people to understand them. He was studying them to manage them, to anticipate their responses, to stay a step ahead. He volunteered at a crisis hotline for people in suicidal distress. He co-authored, or at minimum claimed to have co-authored, a pamphlet on rape prevention for women. He worked for the Seattle Crime Commission, a position that gave him direct access to law enforcement data and exposed a critical flaw in American policing of that era. Jurisdictions did not communicate. A disappearance in one county was invisible to a detective in the next. Bundy didn't just note that gap. He studied it, he mapped it, and he used it. His cousin, we will call her Edna as she has identified herself publicly, was a young woman living near the University of Washington campus in the early 1970s. She was 5 years younger than Bundy, and she adored him. In her own words, he gave her eye contact. He listened. When he spoke to her, she felt like the only person in the room. He dropped by with groceries and wine. He was the big brother she never had, sophisticated, literary, seemingly noble in his work. Behaviorally, this is called manufactured intimacy. It is not inherently sinister. We all do this to some degree. What made Bundy's version dangerous is that it was entirely deliberate. He curated relationships for what they provided him: social cover, geographic access, legitimate reasons to be in the places where he hunted. When Edna's brother John came to install a security bolt on her apartment door, worried about the young women going missing in their neighborhood, Bundy came along. He sat and watched while the lock went in. The man the bolt was meant to keep out was already inside the room, smiling. This is not irony. From a forensic behavioral standpoint, it is the signature move of the organized predator. Position yourself inside the circle of trust. Become part of the solution. Make yourself indispensable, and hunt from there. To understand Ted Bundy's psychology, you first have to understand the concept of the mask. Not metaphorically, clinically. Forensic psychologists who have studied Bundy extensively categorize him as a highly organized, psychopathic predator with narcissistic features and what researchers call a compartmentalized identity. This means he functioned through two distinct modes of being, one public, one private, with a nearly impenetrable wall between them. The public self was the performance. The private self was the predator. What Edna witnessed at a dance club in Seattle in the early 1970s, and what she did not understand until years later, is now recognized in predatory behavior literature as a hunting state. Bundy's jaw clenched. His eyes went dark. He stopped making eye contact with her and began scanning the room. He was not distracted. He was activated. Animal behaviorists have documented this in apex predators. In the moments before an attack, the pupils dilate, maximally to absorb light. In humans, the same physiological response occurs under extreme focus or predatory intent. What Edna saw, his eyes going black, was not metaphor, it was biology. She waved her hands in front of his face. He snapped back. The mask slid up. He smiled. Everything was fine. She filed it away as a strange moment. She did not know she had just watched a predator calculate. This double life architecture also explains something that has puzzled investigators for decades: why Bundy was reported to police multiple times before his arrest, including by his own girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, and yet was repeatedly assessed as too clean, too educated, too articulate to be the suspect. The organized psychopath does not look like what we have been conditioned to fear. He looks like what we have been conditioned to trust. Intelligence, confidence, vocabulary, a history of public service, a sympathetic manner. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a law student, because he was a law student. And that is the first forensic lesson this case teaches us. The profile of a predator is not a face. It is a pattern. January 1974. University of Washington campus, Seattle. A young woman named Karen Sparks is asleep in her apartment, less than a block from where Edna lives. Someone enters in the night. She is beaten savagely with a metal rod from her own bed frame. She is sexually assaulted with the same object. Her roommates find her the following morning covered in blood. She survives, but with permanent brain damage. Investigators have no suspect, no forced entry, no witnesses. Just a young woman who nearly died in her own bed and could not tell them who did it. 4 weeks later, February 1st, 1974. Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old University of Washington student and radio personality, does not show up for her shift at a local radio station. Police visit her apartment. The bed has been made. When they pull back the covers, there is blood on the sheets. Linda is gone. A nightgown, cut from the back, is found hanging in her closet. She was taken from her bed. In a house full of roommates, without a sound. This is what forensic investigators call a controlled abduction. The mark of someone who is planned, rehearsed, and executed with precision. This was not impulsive. This was practiced. Over the next 6 months, a pattern emerged that should have converged faster than it did. Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student, vanished walking to a concert on her own campus at Evergreen State College, near Olympia. Susan Rancourt disappeared from Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. Roberta Parks, who went by Kathy, left her Oregon State University dormitory for ice cream after receiving distressing news about her father's health. She was never seen again. Brenda Ball vanished in the Seattle area. Jorgen Hawkins disappeared from an alley behind her University of Washington sorority house on a night when the alley was full of students. 6 women in 6 months. Different campuses, different counties, different law enforcement jurisdictions. Here is the forensic key to understanding how this was possible. Ted Bundy had spent years studying how American law enforcement agencies failed to share information across county and state lines. He had worked for the Seattle Crime Commission. He had read the data. He understood that a detective in King County had no automatic awareness of a case in Thurston County or Kittitas County. He was not just hunting. He was hunting in a system he had already mapped for its blind spots. The women also shared a physical profile: young, white, college-aged, with long hair parted in the middle. Investigators would note this pattern, but the geographic distribution of the cases initially obscured the connection. It was not until Jorgen Hawkins vanished on the second University of Washington victim that the dots began to connect publicly. Edna, living among these women, was terrified. She and her friends changed their behavior. They stopped walking alone at night. They quit jobs that required them to walk home after dark. The shadow of an unknown predator had reshaped their lives. And Bundy sat with them, sympathetic, indignant, helpful. I hope they catch that guy. It's awful what's going on. July 14th, 1974. Lake Sammamish State Park. A hot Sunday. Roughly 40,000 people descend on the park. Families, couples. The annual Rainier Beer Company picnic. The park is full of witnesses. Bundy arrives in his tan Volkswagen Beetle, his left arm in a white sling, wearing a white tennis outfit. He approaches multiple women throughout the day, politely asking them to help him unload his sailboat from his car. His parents' house is just nearby, he explains. He gives his name as Ted. Several women decline. They do not alert anyone. They simply move on. At approximately 12:30 p.m., a woman named Janice Ott, 23 years old, a probation, caseworker, blonde, kind, and deeply empathetic by every account, agrees to help him. She is watched by witnesses as she redresses, picks up her bicycle, and walks off the beach with the man called Ted. She is never seen alive again. 4 hours later, 19-year-old Denise Naslund leaves the restroom near the parking lot and does not return to her friends. 2 women in one afternoon, in broad daylight, in front of 40,000 people. Witnesses had seen enough to generate a composite sketch and a first name. The suspect drove a tan Volkswagen. His name was Ted. Across the city, Edna and her roommates spread the newspaper out on the dining room table and stared at the sketch. It didn't look like him. The name was a coincidence. Everybody knew guys named Ted. Everybody knew people with VW bugs. They teased him about it when he came over. He laughed. Said the police had already spoken to him. Said he was happy to help however he could. They felt sorry for him. Poor Ted. Having to deal with that embarrassment. September 1974. A hunter in the wooded hills near Issaquah, Washington, roughly 2 miles from Lake Sammamish State Park, stumbles onto skeletal remains. Investigators recover the remains of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. The 2 women taken from the park on July 14th had been left here in the undergrowth, less than 2 miles from where they were abducted. The following spring, March 1975, a more significant forensic discovery occurs. On Taylor Mountain, roughly an hour's drive from Seattle, investigators find the skeletal remains of 4 of the earlier victims: Linda Ann Healy, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, and Brenda Ball. Taylor Mountain, it emerges, had been used repeatedly as a disposal site. Edna's brother John had hiked this exact region with Bundy. On hikes Bundy had specifically initiated. Along routes Bundy had specifically chosen. Not scenic routes, but remote ones. Power line clearings, the backs of housing developments, highway-adjacent woodland. After Bundy's eventual arrest, King County Detective Robert Keppel would subpoena John and take him back out on those trails. Take me where Ted took you. And John did. The proximity of those hikes to Bundy's disposal sites was not coincidental. He had been scouting for months, while hiking with a family member who trusted him completely. August 1975. Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward pulls over a tan Volkswagen Beetle driving suspiciously in Granger, Utah, in the early hours of the morning. The driver is a young man named Ted Bundy. In the car, a ski mask, a pantyhose mask with eye holes cut in it, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, a crowbar. Days earlier, a young woman named Carol Duranch had been approached at the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, by a man posing as a police officer. He told her someone had tried to break into her car. He asked her to come with him to file a report. She got into his Volkswagen Beetle. He attempted to handcuff her. She fought back, leapt from the moving vehicle, and ran to a nearby couple for help. She survived. That same evening, 17-year-old Deborah Kent left a high school play in nearby Bountiful to pick up her younger brother and never came home. Carol Duranch identified Bundy in a police lineup. He was charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He was convicted in 1976 and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. The family held on. This had to be a mistake. Not their Ted. He grew up in their house. He was the boy they knew. But Edna was already beginning the terrible arithmetic. The disappearances in Seattle, his proximity, the hiking routes, the tan VW, the name Ted. She was not there yet. But she was close. In 1986, with Bundy on death row at Florida State Prison following his convictions for murder in Florida, Edna did something that took considerable courage. She wrote to him. Not to reconnect, not to offer comfort. She wrote with a mission. She wanted him to tell the families of his victims where their daughters were. Some of the women he murdered had never been found. She wanted him to come clean. She wanted him to account for what he had done while there was still time. The letters she received back are extraordinary documents, not because they reveal remorse, but because they reveal its complete absence. And because they demonstrate in real time every psychological manipulation technique that Bundy deployed throughout his life, now applied not to potential victims, but to the woman trying to hold him accountable. His first response dismissed her entirely. He told her she had been exposed to years of sensational media coverage, rumors, and gossip about some character named Ted Bundy. He told her she needed to free herself of those images before she could truly know him. He denied killing anyone. Read that again. He denied killing anyone. In 1986, when there was already overwhelming physical evidence of his crimes, when women's bones had been found on mountains he had hiked, when survivors had identified him, he wrote it in ink, calmly, and sent it back with her own letters, as if to say, "Rethink how you're speaking to me." In subsequent letters, the techniques multiply. He lectures her on anger being a barrier to understanding. He tells her she cannot know him until she truly knows herself. He quotes scripture. He speaks of love as the force that heals and transforms. He turns her direct demands. Tell me what you did. Tell them where their daughters are. Into a philosophical seminar on the self. This is textbook coercive control language. When a person refuses to engage with the facts, they colonize the conversation with abstraction. If he can't answer the question, he reframes the question. If he can't defend his actions, he attacks the legitimacy of being asked. You are not my inquisitor. I am under no obligation to prove myself to anyone. There is one letter in which he writes, I have no guilt, remorse, or regret over anything I've done. What's done is done. And then in the same correspondence, I love you, not because of the good memories or despite the bad, but because you are you. He was not conflicted, he was performing. The love and the absence of remorse coexisted without tension because for Ted Bundy, love was not an emotion. It was a tool. It was deployed when it was useful. It was withdrawn when it was not. It existed entirely in service of his need to manage the people around him. Edna wrote him 7 letters. She challenged him with every one. She told him she hated him for what he had done to those women and their families. She told him she wanted to shake him until he broke down. She asked, Are you taking revenge on your mother, on your biological father, on the women who rejected you? She asked him to stop the pretense. He never answered a single direct question. Their correspondence ended with a Christmas card. Dear Edna and Don, much has happened over the years to separate us, but that does not affect the love I have for you. Have a great Christmas. Peace. Ted. Peace. Colorado, 1977. Bundy had been transferred from Utah to face murder charges in the death of Corinne Campbell, a nurse from Dearborn, Michigan, who vanished from the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village while walking from an elevator to her hotel room. Her body was discovered weeks later on a dirt road. She was his first confirmed Colorado victim. Because Bundy insisted on representing himself at trial, a judge ruled that he need not be physically restrained in the courtroom. On June 7, 1977, during a recess, Bundy was permitted to use the second-floor law library at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen. He walked to a window, he looked down, and he jumped. He sprained his ankle on landing. He ran into the mountains above Aspen anyway. For 6 days, he survived in the wilderness, broke into a cabin for food and clothing, and navigated one of the largest manhunts the western slope of Colorado had ever seen. He was recaptured in a stolen car, weaving through Aspen streets, hypothermic, sleep-deprived, and still running. He was returned to jail in Glenwood Springs. He should have been more closely monitored. He was not. Over the next several months, Bundy put a second escape plan into motion with the patience and precision that characterizes everything he did. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the Garfield County Jail. He obtained a hacksaw blade. He intentionally lost 35 pounds. His lawyers noticed the weight loss and mentioned it. No one acted on it. In the evenings, while other prisoners showered, he sawed a hole in the steel-reinforced ceiling of his cell, approximately 1 foot square. He used the crawl space above to scout the layout of the building. He practiced the route. On the night of December 30th, 1977, with most of the jail staff on Christmas leave and the building on a skeleton crew, Bundy piled books and blankets in his bed to simulate a sleeping body. He climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening. He dressed in the jailer's civilian clothes. He walked out the front door. His absence was not discovered for 17 hours. By the time the alarm was raised, Bundy had hitched a ride out of Glenwood Springs, caught a bus to Denver, and boarded a morning flight to Chicago. From Chicago, he traveled to Ann Arbor, Atlanta, and then south to Tallahassee, Florida. Florida, One of the states Edna's brother John had told him carried the harshest death penalty. He went there anyway. And the question forensic psychologists have since debated is whether that choice was irrational or whether it was something far more disturbing. Whether Bundy on some level was accelerating toward his own destruction. Whether the escape was not about survival at all, but about one final uncontrolled release before the end. What happened in Florida supports that reading. January 15th, 1978. Tallahassee. Bundy had been in Florida for less than 2 weeks. In the early hours of the morning, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house near Florida State University through a back door with a faulty lock. What followed in the next 15 minutes was unlike anything in his known history. In Washington, he had been surgical and one victim at a time, carefully chosen, carefully taken. Nick, in the Chi Omega house, he moved from room to room with uncontrolled violence. He beat Margaret Bowman to death with a length of firewood. He entered Lisa Levy's room, strangled her, and sexually assaulted her. He attacked Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, who survived with broken jaws and head injuries. He left the building, walked to a nearby apartment on Dunwoody Street, and attacked FSU student Cheryl Thomas, who survived but was left permanently deaf in one ear. 4 attacks in a single night. 2 dead. 3 survivors. This was not the controlled, calculated Bundy who had operated invisibly for years. This was a man whose internal architecture had fractured. Forensic behavioral analysts describe this kind of escalation in serial offenders as decompensation, the collapse of the psychological structure that allows the predator to maintain his public self. The mask does not just slip here, it shatters. The discipline that sustained the performance for years gives way entirely. 3 weeks later, February 9th, 1978, Bundy abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school in Lake City, Florida. She had left her classroom to retrieve her purse. He drove her approximately 35 miles from where he took her and left her body near the Suwannee River State Park. She was found 2 months later. On February 15th, 1978, a Pensacola police officer named David Lee noticed a stolen Volkswagen Beetle being driven erratically in the early hours of the morning. He pulled it over. The driver gave a false name. A brief struggle followed. The man was handcuffed and placed in the patrol car. He was identified the following day as Theodore Bundy, the Colorado escapee on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. The car contained the identification documents of several women. It was over. Ted Bundy was tried twice in Florida. The first trial in Miami in 1979 was for the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy at the Chi Omega sorority house. The second trial, held in Orlando, was for the murder of Kimberly Leach. He represented himself at both. Observers, including Edna watching from the other side of the country, recognized the behavior immediately. This was not a legal strategy. This was theater. The courtroom was the room he had been performing in his entire life. The cameras gave him an audience larger than any he had ever had. He questioned witnesses. He gave speeches. He raised his arms. He smiled at the gallery. When Edna watched him raise his arms in the courtroom on television, she said it harkened directly back to the day she had watched him, standing in a Seattle crowd, arms spread, announcing himself, "I'm Ted Bundy. I'm Ted Bundy." He was convicted at both trials. He was sentenced to death 3 times. And then for the next decade, he appealed. He stalled. He leveraged every procedural mechanism available to a man who had studied law. And when the appeals ran out, he did the one thing he had refused to do for years. He began to confess. But even his confessions were calculated. Investigators and journalists who sat with him in the final days before his January 24th, 1989 execution have noted the pattern. He would confess to a murder, exchange details for a stay of execution request, and then wait to see if the stay came through. He was trading dead women's whereabouts for more time, his last leverage, his last performance of control. He ultimately confessed to 30 murders across 7 states: California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, committed between 1973 and 1978. The true number may never be known. Forensic psychology does not deal in certainty when it comes to the origins of a predator. But the elements of Ted Bundy's development that researchers point to most consistently form a recognizable pattern. The secret of his birth, the shame embedded in his origins, an identity built on concealment from the very beginning, a grandmother who was reportedly volatile, a grandfather whose emotional distance compelled young Ted to seek validation from the world outside the home, a family that prized appearance, a social environment that rewarded charm and intelligence and asked no questions about what lay beneath them. He learned early that performance was currency, that the right words, the right posture, the right context could open any door. He studied psychology to understand people. He volunteered at the crisis hotline, interestingly, to be around people in their most vulnerable moments to hear what broke them. He absorbed the rape prevention study not to prevent rape, but to understand its mechanics. He was, in the clinical language, an instrumental predator. Everything he did served a purpose. The volunteering, the charm, the family relationships, the legal study, the rape prevention work, the Seattle Crime Commission position. All of it was infrastructure. All of it was preparation. Whether he consciously designed it that way from the beginning, or whether the predator simply used what was available, is a question that cannot be fully resolved. What we can say is this: every aspect of his public life ultimately served his private one. The organized psychopath does not suffer internally in the way we imagine. There is no guilt corroding the performance from within. The mask is not maintained against mounting psychological pressure. The mask is simply who he chose to present, as naturally as the rest of us choose our clothes. What lies beneath it is not a secret he is struggling to keep. It is a self he has no particular feeling about. Bundy told a journalist he was the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. He was not tormented by that. He was descriptive. The letters to Edna confirm it. I have no guilt, remorse, or regret over anything I've done. He wrote that. He sent it. He signed it. Be good. I love you, Ted. That is not cognitive dissonance. That is compartmentalization, so complete that there is no connection between the acts and the self that committed them. He had built a wall so high that not even his own death could bring it down.